The Critique of the Gotha Program by Karl Marx. Quotes. Critique of the Gotha Program by Karl Marx is a sharp analysis of socialist thought, critiquing the compromises within the German Workers' Party's Gotha Program and defending Marx's vision of socialism. In this incisive critique, Marx dissects the program's stances on labor, social equity, and the transition to a socialist society, rejecting ideas like equal rights in a future socialist society and arguing that these conceptions only sustain capitalist ideologies. Instead, Marx presents a nuanced vision of socialism, where individuals receive from society based on their labor. But the higher phase of communism ensures distribution according to needs, transcending class structures, and enabling true emancipation. This work offers essential insights into Marx's philosophy, advocating for a radical break from capitalist and Lassallean ideals in favor of a democratic, classless society that fosters genuine human freedom and cooperation. Quote 1. Social classes are abolished, but inequalities persist. The application of an equal standard, actual labor time, to unlike individuals leads to unequal levels of compensation. The explanation illustrates Marx's view on socialism, highlighting that even though the class structures are dismantled, certain inequalities still exist because different individuals contribute differently to society. Marx does not argue for identical outcomes for everyone. Rather, individuals are rewarded based on their actual contributions in terms of labor time. This is a fundamental distinction that emphasizes fairness based on input, not absolute equality, thus reflecting how disparities might still emerge despite the absence of social classes. Quote 2. Each individual is compensated solely on the number of hours that she works, everything else being ignored. Marx makes it clear that in the early phase of socialism, compensation is strictly tied to the number of hours worked, irrespective of other factors such as productivity or complexity of labor. This approach aims to eradicate all remnants of wage labor that is common under capitalism, thereby setting a standard that bases rewards on direct contribution, which is intended to ensure equity while still recognizing the inherent differences in individuals' work habits and capabilities. Quote 3. A post-capitalist society cannot immediately realize from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, since it is bound to emerge tainted with the birthmarks of the old society. Marx argues that the immediate realization of a fully egalitarian society is not possible because the remnants of capitalism, birthmarks, cannot be eradicated overnight. There are transitional stages required to eliminate the influence of the previous society, and achieving a state where goods and services are distributed purely based on needs requires historical and social evolution. This perspective underscores that building a new society is a gradual process rather than an instantaneous shift. Quote 4. Labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime desire and necessity. In Marx's envisioned higher phase of socialism, labor transcends its role as a mere means of survival. Instead, it becomes an intrinsic part of human fulfillment, suggesting that the value of work lies not in economic necessity, but in personal satisfaction and contribution to the collective. This shift is vital for reaching the advanced stages of socialism, where labor is about self-actualization and collective well-being, thus transforming how individuals view and value their contributions. Quote 5. The lower phase will in due course give rise to a higher one that dispenses with actual labor time as a measure, since we will by then have learned to live without being governed by a quid pro quo. Marx believes that as society progresses beyond the initial stage of socialism, it will eventually move away from quantifying labor and rewards strictly through labor time. The idea is that, over time, people will no longer be motivated by direct exchanges or rewards for their work. Instead, they will contribute out of shared interest and intrinsic motivation, leading to a society governed by free time and creative fulfillment, rather than economic necessity. Quote 6. The lower phase is still defective, since, as Marx notes, there is a parallel with commodity production in the very restricted sense that it is governed by an exchange of equivalents. Marx acknowledges that even in the early stages of socialism, there are remnants of exchange relations similar to those under capitalism. While these exchanges are now based on labor contributions and are free from capitalist exploitation, they still resemble the old system in that what individuals receive depends on what they give. This indicates that while progress has been made, complete liberation from the structures of capitalism is yet to be achieved, and some form of measured exchange persists. Quote 7. Once this is achieved, along with the end of the opposition between mental and manual labor, the all-round development of the individual, and all springs of cooperative wealth that flow more abundantly, a higher phase can be reached in which labor becomes life's prime desire and necessity. In Marx's view, the full realization of socialism involves the removal of divisions between types of labor, specifically between intellectual and manual work. This allows for the comprehensive development of individuals, fostering an environment where labor is no longer a burden, but a source of personal fulfillment. Only under such conditions, when the social context supports and enhances cooperative production, can a truly advanced phase of socialism be reached, where work is intrinsically motivated rather than compelled by necessity. Quote 8. But since this measure is not an abstract average imposed upon us against our will, but an expression of what we freely decide to do with our time, it is more than likely that we will choose to work as few hours as possible in order to enjoy the many fruits of life outside of labor. Marx emphasizes that under the lower phase of socialism, labor time as a measure is based on free choice rather than coercion. This freedom allows individuals to determine how much time they wish to devote to work, creating a balance between labor and personal enjoyment. The social incentive shifts toward reducing working hours, promoting a more fulfilled and enriched life where cultural, social, and personal pursuits take precedence over labor for survival. Quote 9. The lower phase of socialism-communism, by ignoring his discussion of labor time calculation and arguing instead that wage labor prevails in socialism, which he wrongly identifies as a distinct social formation from communism. In this critique, Marx explains that early-stage socialism, often misconstrued as a separate entity from communism, still involves some calculated labor measurements, but is distinct from wage labor. The notion that wage labor, which inherently requires capital, could prevail in socialism misunderstands Marx's principles. Instead, early socialism must move towards forming new human relations free from domination by labor products, thus aiming to establish a society without capital or wage labor structures. Quote 10. Closely connected with the above, post-Marx Marxists almost universally viewed the fundamental distinction between capitalism and socialism as the anarchy of the market versus planned production. Marx argues that reducing the difference between capitalism and socialism to market chaos versus planned economies oversimplifies the real transformation needed. Socialism involves more than a shift in economic planning. It's about fundamentally restructuring human relations, eliminating alienation, and creating a society where labor is freely associated. This explanation shows how reducing socialism to mere planned production ignores the broader social and human liberation aspects Marx emphasized in his works. Quote 11. We need theoretical as well as practical sources to confront and deal with this crisis. Marx is emphasizing the necessity of not only practical actions, but also sound theoretical understanding to address the ongoing crisis of capitalism and envision a non-capitalist society. The quote implies that practical measures without a guiding theoretical framework would be insufficient to create meaningful change. Marx believed that any attempt to challenge capitalism must be grounded in deep theoretical insights to ensure it effectively addresses the roots of the issue and lays the foundation for a viable alternative. Without both theory and practice working hand in hand, The movement for an alternative to capitalism lacks clear direction and purpose. Quote 12. Marx largely avoided entering into discussions of a future society on the grounds that communism is not a utopian ideal that one tries to impose upon the masses, but is instead the result of the self-activity of the masses. Marx's reluctance to provide a detailed blueprint for a future society was rooted in his belief that true socialism or communism must be developed through the self-emancipation of the masses. He critiqued utopian thinkers who imagined a perfect society without acknowledging the role of the working class in bringing that vision to life. Marx argued that the masses must actively shape their destiny, and any externally imposed system would ultimately fail to empower individuals. The focus on self-activity underscores the importance of organic, grassroots movements as the driving force for change, rather than relying on a predefined structure that could lead to authoritarian control. Quote 13. For Marx, a proper understanding of the alternative to a society dominated by capital lies in grasping the nature of capital. Marx argues that the key to imagining an alternative to capitalism is to understand the fundamental nature of capital itself. Capital, in Marx's view, is not just a physical object or money, but a social relation that dominates and shapes human interactions. By fully understanding how capital functions and the mechanisms it uses to control society, one can effectively envision a new system that addresses these exploitative dynamics. This point highlights that a simplistic view of abolishing private ownership or markets is insufficient. It is necessary to dismantle the deeper social relations that underpin capital. Quote 14. Because they lacked an adequate understanding of capital, they also had an inadequate understanding of the alternative to capital. Marx was critical of many of his followers for not fully understanding the concept of capital, which led to an incomplete and flawed vision of what a post-capitalist society should be. Without grasping the exploitative nature of value production and the dynamics of abstract labor, these socialists ended up proposing solutions that did not truly transcend the structures of capitalism. The critique underscores Marx's insistence that overcoming capitalism requires a profound understanding of its inner workings to ensure that new structures do not replicate the old systems of oppression. Marx's quote 15. Great achievement in capital is showing that capital is self-expanding value, and capitalism's defining feature is that labor assumes a value form. In Capital, Marx explains that the essence of capital is its self-expansion, where value continuously grows through the exploitation of labor. This means that under capitalism, labor is reduced to a commodity that creates value, and this value is primarily expressed in monetary terms. The reduction of labor to value form leads to alienation and exploitation, as the workers' humanity is disregarded in favor of their productivity. This insight is crucial to understanding why capitalism is inherently dehumanizing and why any genuine alternative must move away from value-based production. Quote 16. The central and decisive argument that Marx makes against capitalism is that we are not in control of time. On the contrary, time increasingly controls us. Marx argues that under capitalism, people are not in control of their own time, as their lives are dictated by the demands of socially necessary labor time. Time becomes a force that imposes itself upon individuals, controlling their actions and reducing their lives to mere labor output. This is a form of alienation that Marx views as a defining feature of capitalist society. A key aspect of overcoming capitalism, therefore, is to regain control over time, transforming labor into an activity that serves human needs rather than an imposed necessity dictated by capital. Quote 17. Radical movements have suffered from the depth of Marx's critique of capital not being fully understood. Marx suggests that many radical movements failed to offer a viable alternative to capitalism because they did not adequately grasp his deep critique of value production. These movements often focused on superficial reforms, like the nationalization of industries or planned economies, without addressing the underlying exploitative relationships tied to abstract labor and value. As a result, Even supposedly socialist systems ended up replicating many of capitalism's dehumanizing features. Marx's point here is that true liberation requires not just a change in economic structures, but a transformation of social relations at a fundamental level. Quote 18. In a post-capitalist society, products are directly objects of utility and do not assume a value form. Marx envisions a post-capitalist society where goods are produced based on their utility rather than for their exchange value. This means that production is no longer driven by the pursuit of profit, but by the needs and well-being of individuals. In such a society, the relationship between people and the products they create changes fundamentally. Goods are no longer commodities with monetary value, but are simply means to fulfill human needs. This shift is essential for eliminating the alienation that occurs when human labor is turned into a commodity under capitalism. Quote 19. Value production comes to an end from the very inception of a socialist or communist society. Marx asserts that in a socialist or communist society, the concept of value production, where labor produces commodities for exchange, is abolished. Instead, production is organized to meet the needs of society without the mediation of exchange value or money. This signifies a complete departure from capitalist modes of production, where labor is valued based on its contribution to capital. In a true socialist society, human activities are valued for their utility and contribution to the community rather than being reduced to economic transactions. Quote 20. The state for Marx is abolished by the time we reach socialism or communism, since its basis, class society, is long gone. Marx argues that in a fully realized socialist or communist society, the state as an institution becomes unnecessary and eventually ceases to exist. The state, in Marx's analysis, is inherently tied to class structures and exists to manage and perpetuate the interests of the ruling class. Once class distinctions are eliminated, the coercive functions of the state are no longer required. This reflects Marx's vision of a society where people self-govern through democratic and cooperative mechanisms rather than being subjected to state power. Quote 21. Essentially, what Marx said here is that law of value will still be operative in a socialist society. Although there are restrictions, nothing but labor can enter into exchange, and nothing can pass to the ownership of the means of production. This quote points out a common misinterpretation regarding Marx's understanding of value in a socialist society. The statement that the law of value would continue to operate under socialism contradicts Marx's critique of the Gotha Program. Marx clarifies that, in a socialist society, labor does not exchange for value in the same way as it does under capitalism. Instead, labor time becomes the measure by which goods are distributed, eliminating the capitalist mode of value production. This distinction is crucial because it underlines that socialism, as Marx envisioned, fundamentally changes how labor and products relate to one another, moving away from value as a monetary measure toward worth based on direct utility to society. Quote 22. By displacing labor from the process of production through technological innovations, the very basis of value production eventually becomes undermined. Marx suggests that with the advancement of technology, labor's role in production decreases, challenging the foundation of value creation under capitalism. As machines replace workers, the social basis for labor as the defining source of value weakens. This provides the opportunity for society to reorganize itself in a way that moves beyond the need for labor to be the central measure of value. In this future state, individuals would relate to production differently, not as direct laborers, but as participants in a process that they oversee and regulate, focusing on the general well-being of society rather than maximizing labor output for capital. Quote 23. A post-capitalist society that overcomes value production would therefore privilege free time over labor time. Marx envisions a society where labor is no longer a compulsion, and the primary focus shifts to increasing free time. Under capitalism, value production is predicated on exploiting labor time, treating it as a measure of economic value. However, in a society that has moved beyond capitalism, The idea is to reduce the necessity of labor, thereby maximizing free time for personal growth and fulfillment. This shift reflects a move towards human emancipation, where individuals are free from the constraints of labor as a dominating social force, allowing for a richer and more varied social existence. Quote 24. Marx denies that labor will be abolished in socialism, communism. Marx makes it clear that even in a socialist or communist society, labor will continue to exist, though in a fundamentally different form. The nature of labor changes from being a means to create surplus value, as seen under capitalism, to becoming an integral part of life that fulfills individual needs and desires. Labor is no longer alienated or forced, but becomes a creative and fulfilling activity. The goal is not the elimination of labor altogether, but rather the transformation of labor into a voluntary, non-exploitative practice that serves both personal and communal needs. Quote 25. To go from capitalism to socialism, communism, is to go from a world in which individuals are dominated by their own creations to one that is freely associated. Marx explains that the transition from capitalism to socialism involves eliminating the alienation that arises when people are dominated by their own labor products, such as capital and commodities. In socialism, individuals collectively and freely associate to produce and distribute goods, eliminating the power of abstract social forces over them. This change means that production is driven by communal needs rather than the demands of capital accumulation, leading to a society where individuals can shape their lives and relationships without being subjected to the dictates of the market or capital. Quote 26. The dictatorship of the proletariat represents the suppression of state power by the organized power of society. Marx describes the dictatorship of the proletariat not as a repressive, authoritarian state, but as a transitional period during which the organized working class actively dismantles the remnants of capitalist power. This period aims to suppress state power and gradually replace it with the self-organization of society, led by the formerly oppressed. Rather than being about the domination of a state apparatus, it is about empowering the masses to reorganize society in their interest, thus rendering the state obsolete as class distinctions are erased and communal self-governance takes hold. Quote 27. Socialism or communism is incompatible with the state, since the latter is an excrescence of class society that is superseded in a post-capitalist society. Marx argues that in a truly socialist or communist society, the state becomes unnecessary because its primary function, maintaining class distinctions and managing social conflicts, ceases to exist. The state is a product of capitalist and class-based societies, and its role is to enforce the interests of the ruling class. Once those class distinctions are abolished, the need for a state dissipates, and society can function based on communal and cooperative principles without hierarchical enforcement mechanisms. The vision is for a society where social functions are carried out collectively without coercion, making the state redundant. Quote 28. Free human beings expend their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single force. Marx envisions a society where individuals engage in various forms of productive activities not as isolated or alienated laborers, but as part of a collective endeavor. In such a society, labor is no longer an individual, commodified act sold on the market. Instead, it becomes a shared, conscious effort that contributes to the overall well-being of the community. This represents a profound transformation in the nature of work, where labor is no longer tied to individual economic survival, but is freely given and collectively managed to meet communal needs, fostering unity and cooperation. Quote 29. The destruction being wrought on society and nature by the relentless accumulation of value for its own sake is jeopardizing the future of life on this planet. Marx warns that the unending pursuit of value accumulation under capitalism has destructive consequences for both human society and the natural environment. The drive to generate surplus value, irrespective of social or ecological costs, leads to widespread exploitation, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. This critique highlights the urgent need to rethink economic systems that prioritize profit over sustainability, pointing toward the necessity of developing a post-capitalist society that respects both human and ecological limits, ensuring a viable future for all forms of life. Quote 30. Labor is the source of all wealth and all culture, and since useful labor is possible only in society and through society, the proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society. This statement from the Gotha Program asserts that labor is the foundational element of both wealth and culture, and emphasizes that since productive labor can only occur in a social context, all the benefits derived from it should be equally distributed among all members of society. The program emphasizes a collectivist approach to labor, suggesting that each individual's work is part of a broader social effort, and therefore its rewards should not be monopolized by a few, but shared among all. However, Marx criticized this notion as simplistic, pointing out that this formulation ignores the necessary deductions required for communal needs, such as supporting those unable to work, maintaining communal resources, and future investments. It also conflates material wealth with value, which Marx argued was specific to capitalist production. Quote 31. The emancipation of labor must be the work of the working class, in relation to which all other classes are only one reactionary mass. This quote underscores the belief that the liberation of labor, freeing workers from exploitation, must be achieved by the workers themselves. It dismisses other social classes as reactionary, implying that they are obstacles to the emancipation of labor. Marx agreed that the working class must lead its own emancipation, but warned against viewing all other classes as monolithic and uniformly reactionary. This perspective could oversimplify the potential alliances and support from different social groups who might also suffer under capitalism and could contribute to the struggle for socialism. Quote 32. The working class strives for its emancipation, first of all within the framework of the present-day national states, conscious that the necessary result of its efforts, which are common to the workers of all civilized countries, will be the international brotherhood of peoples. Here, the Gotha Program presents a two-stage approach to emancipation, first within the boundaries of national states and then as part of a broader international movement. It implies that the initial struggle for workers' rights and socialism will happen nationally, but ultimately aims for international solidarity and cooperation among workers globally. Marx critiqued this nationalist framing, arguing that it failed to sufficiently emphasize the inherently international nature of the working-class struggle. He believed that capitalism was a global system, and that a socialist revolution would need to transcend national boundaries from the outset to succeed, emphasizing internationalism over nationalism. Quote 33. The German Workers' Party strives by all legal means for the free state and a socialist society, the abolition of the wage system together with the iron law of wages and exploitation in every form. This part of the program outlines the party's commitment to achieving socialism through legal and peaceful means, including the abolition of the wage system, which they argue perpetuates economic inequality and exploitation. Marx criticized the vagueness of such formulations, pointing out that merely aiming for a free state was insufficient for true emancipation. He believed that the state, as an instrument of class domination, could not simply be reformed into a free entity, but needed to be dismantled and replaced by new forms of direct, cooperative governance led by the working class. The focus on legal means also downplays the role of revolutionary struggle that Marx saw as necessary for dismantling the capitalist state apparatus. Quote 34. The German Workers' Party demands the establishment of producers' cooperative societies with state aid under the democratic control of the working people. The program advocates for the formation of cooperatives, funded by the state, as a means to transition towards a socialist economy. These cooperatives are envisioned to operate under the democratic oversight of workers. Marx was critical of relying on state aid for the establishment of cooperatives, as he argued that such reliance could lead to a continuation of state control over production, rather than genuine worker control. Marx emphasized that true socialism required the direct and autonomous organization of production by workers themselves, without dependence on the existing capitalist state, which would inherently limit the scope of worker self-management and autonomy. Quote 35. Universal and equal elementary education of the people by the state. Universal compulsory school attendance. Free instruction. The Gotha Program calls for state-provided universal education, emphasizing equality and accessibility. Marx agreed on the importance of education, but was wary of state control over it. He believed that education should be free from the influence of the capitalist state, which could use it to propagate its ideology and maintain control over the working class. For Marx, education should empower individuals to think critically and become active participants in society, rather than serve as a means to reproduce the existing class structure. He envisioned education as a liberatory force, not merely as a state tool to instill conformity. Quote 36. The German Workers' Party demands for the protection of the working class against the power of capital within present-day society. Right of combination. Koalitionsfreiheit. This demand emphasizes the right of workers to form unions and associations as a means of protecting themselves against capitalist exploitation. Marx supported workers' rights to organize, but viewed this as only one component of the broader struggle against capitalism. While unions are crucial for defending workers' immediate interests, Marx argued that the ultimate goal must be the overthrow of the capitalist system itself, not merely the mitigation of its worst abuses. Thus, while the right to unionize is necessary, it is insufficient for achieving the full emancipation of the working class, which requires a revolutionary transformation of society. Quote 37. Every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs. Marx emphasizes the importance of practical real-world progress over theoretical statements or declarations of principles. He criticizes the focus on creating a program of principles during the unification of the socialist parties, suggesting that it would have been more effective to concentrate on taking action against the common enemy of capitalism. Marx argues that real change is driven by tangible actions rather than by adopting idealized programs, which can often become empty rhetoric disconnected from the practical struggle. This statement reflects Marx's belief in the primacy of material practice over abstract theorizing, especially in political organizing. Quote 38. After the Unity Congress is finished, Engels and I will publish a short statement to the effect that we completely disassociate ourselves from said program's principles and have nothing to do with it. Marx conveys his strong disapproval of the Gotha Program, which resulted from the unification of different socialist factions. He and Engels intend to publicly distance themselves from the program because they believe it compromises core socialist principles and is ultimately harmful to the movement. Marx is concerned about the influence this program could have on the perception of socialism, particularly since it could falsely associate him and Engels with views they do not endorse. This highlights Marx's insistence on maintaining ideological clarity and integrity, even at the risk of distancing themselves from a large section of the socialist movement. Quote 39. It is my duty not to give recognition, even by diplomatic silence, to what, according to my convictions, is a thoroughly objectionable program that is demoralizing for the party. Marx feels a responsibility to voice his criticism of the Gotha Program rather than remaining silent, even if doing so might cause conflict within the socialist movement. He believes that the compromises made in the program are not only flawed, but could also demoralize and mislead the working-class movement. Marx insists that any tacit acceptance of such a compromised program would be detrimental to the socialist cause. This underscores his dedication to upholding what he views as the true revolutionary principles of socialism, rejecting any dilution or compromise that could undermine the movement's goals. Quote 40. The Lassallean leaders came because circumstances forced this upon them. Marx argues that the leaders of the Lassallean faction agreed to unification out of necessity rather than genuine ideological alignment. He implies that the Lassalleans were in a weakened position and had little choice but to join forces with Marx's followers. Despite this, Marx criticizes how his own faction allowed the Lassalleans to impose their demands, leading to a program that incorporated Lassallean ideas, which Marx found unacceptable. This highlights Marx's frustration with the concessions made to the Lassalleans, who he believed had compromised socialist principles and sought to capitalize on the unification for their own benefit. Quote 41. One knows that the mere fact of unification is satisfying to the workers, but it is a mistake to believe that this momentary success is not bought too dearly. Marx acknowledges that the unification of the socialist factions brought immediate satisfaction to the workers, as it symbolized a strengthening of their movement. However, he warns that the compromises made to achieve this unity came at too high a cost, particularly in terms of ideological integrity. Marx is concerned that the concessions made, especially to Lassallean ideas, would weaken the foundation of the socialist movement in the long run. This statement reflects his belief that true unity must be based on strong, uncompromised principles, rather than superficial agreements that could undermine the movement's effectiveness and cohesion. Quote 42. Labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values as labor. Marx emphasizes that labor alone cannot be considered the sole source of wealth, as nature also plays an essential role in creating use values, which are the basis of material wealth. This critique points out that the Gotha Program oversimplifies the complex relationship between labor and the natural world, ignoring that labor is only possible when humans utilize natural resources. Marx stresses that this omission leads to a distorted understanding of wealth creation, where nature's contribution is overlooked, which in turn reinforces a false narrative that labor itself has a supernatural power to create wealth independently. This critique also highlights how such a view benefits the bourgeoisie, who can justify the exploitation of workers by disregarding the dependency on natural resources. Quote 43. The proceeds of labor belong to society, and only so much therefrom accrues to the individual worker, as is not required to maintain the condition of labor, society. Marx argues that, since labor is inherently social, the proceeds of labor should first be directed to maintaining society as a whole before being distributed to individual workers. This means that society must prioritize certain deductions, such as the maintenance and development of the means of production, education, health care, and other communal needs. Marx critiques the Gotha Program for its misleading claim that the undiminished proceeds of labor should be distributed equally among all members of society, pointing out that such a simplistic formulation fails to account for the necessary communal responsibilities. Therefore, the idea of undiminished proceeds is inherently flawed, as it overlooks the essential contributions to the collective welfare that must be deducted from the total product. Quote 44. What is a fair distribution? Do not the bourgeois assert that the present-day distribution is fair? Marx questions the concept of fair distribution, noting that what is considered fair is often determined by the existing mode of production and the power structures within society. In capitalist society, the bourgeoisie claim that the current distribution of wealth is fair because it aligns with the existing laws and norms of that system. Marx argues that ideas of fairness are shaped by economic conditions, and that focusing on distribution without addressing the underlying mode of production is misguided. True fairness, in Marx's view, can only be achieved by fundamentally changing the system of production, rather than simply redistributing the products within the same exploitative framework. Quote 45. Within a cooperatively organized society, based on common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products. Marx describes a future communist society where the means of production are collectively owned, and the need for commodity exchange is eliminated. In such a society, production is carried out to meet communal needs rather than for profit, and the products of labor are distributed according to social needs rather than through market exchange. This represents a fundamental shift from capitalist society, where labor and its products are commodified and subject to exchange value. In a communist society, the direct association of producers ensures that the value of labor is no longer abstracted into monetary terms, and the labor contributed by each individual is recognized directly as part of the collective effort. Quote 46. In proportion as labor develops socially and becomes thereby a source of wealth and culture, poverty and destitution develop among the workers, and wealth and culture among the non-workers. Marx highlights the contradictory nature of capitalist development, where the socialization of labor and the increase in productivity lead to greater wealth for the bourgeoisie, while simultaneously deepening poverty among the working class. The more labor becomes a collective effort, the more it produces wealth. But this wealth is appropriated by those who do not contribute labor, namely the capitalists. Marx criticizes the Gotha Program for failing to acknowledge this dynamic and for not demonstrating how the workers can break free from this historical cycle of exploitation. He calls for a concrete analysis of how the current material conditions enable the working class to challenge and ultimately overcome this systemic inequality. Quote 47. The right of the producers is proportional to the labor they supply. The equality consists in measurement that is made with an equal standard, labor. Marx explains that in the lower phase of communism, distribution is based on the amount of labor contributed by each individual. While this represents progress from capitalist society, it still retains elements of inequality because individuals have different abilities and capacities to work. Thus, even with equal labor time, the outcomes are unequal due to the differences in personal circumstances and capabilities. This form of distribution is inherently limited because it does not yet transcend the bourgeois principle of equivalence. Labor is still measured and rewarded according to a standard that ultimately reflects differences in productivity and capacity. Marx sees this as a necessary but transitional stage, where the limitations of equal right still reflect the vestiges of bourgeois society. Quote 48. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor has vanished, society inscribes on its banners, "From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs." Marx envisions a fully developed communist society where the division of labor, which limits individuals to specific roles, is abolished. In this higher phase, labor becomes a fulfilling and voluntary activity, and people contribute according to their abilities while receiving according to their needs. This represents the complete transcendence of bourgeois norms of exchange and distribution. In such a society, the concept of right based on labor contributions becomes obsolete, as social relations are no longer mediated by the exchange of equivalents. Instead, the focus is on the free development of each individual, supported by the collective wealth of society, which allows everyone to realize their full potential without the constraints of economic necessity. Quote 49. The distribution of the means of consumption is only a consequence of the distribution of the conditions of production themselves. Marx argues that the way goods are distributed in society is determined by how the means of production are owned and controlled. In capitalist society, the distribution of consumption goods reflects the fact that the means of production are owned by a small class of capitalists, while the majority owns only their labor power. Marx criticizes the Gotha Program's focus on distribution without addressing the underlying relations of production. He stresses that a just distribution of goods can only be achieved by transforming the ownership and control of the means of production, making them collectively owned by the workers themselves. Without such a transformation, any attempt at fair distribution remains superficial and ultimately ineffective. Quote 50. The system of wage labor is a system of slavery, and indeed of a slavery that becomes proportionally more severe as the social productive forces of labor develop. Marx argues that wage labor under capitalism is fundamentally a form of slavery, albeit one that evolves in severity as productivity increases. In the capitalist system, workers are only allowed to work and live as long as they produce value for the capitalist, and their conditions do not necessarily improve with advancements in productivity. Instead, these improvements can lead to increased exploitation by lengthening the working day or intensifying labor demands. Marx critiques the Gotha Program for reverting to Lassalle's ideas, which fail to understand the true nature of wages as a form of exploitation masked by economic exchange. The comparison to slavery emphasizes that workers remain under the control of those who own the means of production, regardless of whether their wages improve. Quote 51. Instead of arising from the revolutionary process of transformation of society, the socialist organization of the total labor arises from the state aid that the state gives to the producers' cooperative societies. Marx criticizes the Gotha Program's reliance on state aid to create cooperative societies, suggesting that this approach misunderstands the nature of socialism. He argues that socialism must emerge from the revolutionary transformation of society, driven by the workers themselves, rather than being established by state intervention. By relying on state loans to create cooperatives, the Gotha Program implies that a new society can be built in a top-down manner, without fundamentally changing the relations of production. Marx dismisses this idea as overly simplistic and indicative of Lassalle's influence, which emphasized state involvement instead of grassroots, worker-led revolution. He stresses that true cooperative production must arise from the independent actions of the working class, not from government patronage. Quote 52. Freedom consists in converting the state from an organ superimposed upon society into one completely subordinate to it. Marx describes true freedom as the subordination of the state to society, rather than the state acting as a separate and dominating entity. In a genuinely free society, the state should not be an oppressive force above the people. Instead, it must be fully integrated and controlled by the community it serves. Marx critiques the Gotha Program for its ambiguous language regarding the free state, suggesting that such phrasing implies that the state itself must be liberated, rather than reformed to serve the interests of society. He emphasizes that the workers' movement must aim to dismantle the existing state structures that uphold class divisions and transform the state into a tool that is entirely under societal control. Quote 53. Between capitalist and communist society, there lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx explains that the transition from capitalism to communism requires a political period in which the working class takes control of the state and uses it to suppress the remnants of the old bourgeois order. This dictatorship of the proletariat is not a form of oppressive rule, but rather a necessary phase during which the workers dismantle the old state apparatus and build new institutions that serve their collective interests. Marx criticizes the Gotha Program for failing to address this transitional period, thereby ignoring the practical realities of how to achieve a communist society. The concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat reflects Marx's belief that the working class must seize power to prevent counter-revolution and to guide society toward the abolition of all class distinctions. Quote 54. Even vulgar democracy, which sees the millennium in the democratic republic and has no suspicion that it is precisely in this last form of the state, in bourgeois society, that the class struggle has to be fought out to a conclusion, even it towers mountains above this kind of democratism. Marx critiques the Gotha Program for its shallow understanding of democracy, comparing it unfavorably even to vulgar democracy, which idealizes the democratic republic as the ultimate goal. He points out that the democratic republic, though seen as an ideal by some, is still fundamentally a form of bourgeois state, and it is within this form that the class struggle must be fully realized and fought to its conclusion. The Gotha Program's vision of democratism, which stays within the limits of what is legally permissible under the current system, is, according to Marx, far less revolutionary than even the flawed aspirations of vulgar Democrats. He emphasizes that genuine progress requires a deep understanding of the nature of the state and the necessity of transcending bourgeois forms of governance. Quote 55. Elementary education by the state is altogether objectionable. Government and church should instead be equally excluded from any influence on the schools. Marx opposes the idea of state-controlled education, as proposed by the Gotha Program, arguing that neither the government nor the church should have influence over schools. He believes that true education must be independent of both state and religious authority to ensure that it serves the needs of the people rather than the interests of those in power. State control over education, particularly in the context of the Prusso-German Empire, would likely reinforce existing class structures and propagate state ideology. Marx envisions an education system that empowers individuals and encourages critical thinking, free from the influence of any ruling authority. This critique highlights his commitment to a form of education that promotes genuine liberation rather than conformity. Quote 56. The administration of criminal justice is to be had free everywhere. That of civil justice is concerned almost exclusively with conflicts over property, and hence affects almost exclusively the propertied classes. Marx points out that the demand for free administration of justice, as outlined in the Gotha Program, is somewhat misguided. Criminal justice is already free in most places, while civil justice, largely dealing with property disputes, primarily benefits the propertied classes. Therefore, making civil justice freely accessible would mainly serve the interests of those who own property rather than addressing the needs of the working class. Marx suggests that the program should focus on demands that directly benefit workers and address their specific grievances, rather than making blanket statements that fail to consider the real implications of such demands within the context of class society. Quote 57. Prohibition of child labor. Here it was absolutely essential to state the age limit. Marx criticizes the vague language used in the Gotha Program regarding the prohibition of child labor, noting that it fails to specify an age limit. He argues that a general prohibition on child labor is impractical in the context of large-scale industry, where a complete ban would be reactionary and detrimental to both children and society. Instead, Marx advocates for a well-regulated system that combines education with productive labor, allowing children to learn practical skills while being protected from exploitation. By not specifying an age limit or addressing the complexities of child labor, the Gotha Program misses an opportunity to propose a realistic and progressive solution that balances the need for education with the benefits of early productive engagement. Critique of the Gotha Program by Karl Marx underscores capitalism's contradictions, insisting that socialist society must establish new social relations rather than modify existing capitalist structures. Marx argues that a classless, stateless society would be grounded in production for collective well-being rather than profit. He critiques superficial reforms, calling instead for the abolishment of wage labor and capitalist notions of fair distribution, to realize a society where individuals contribute and receive according to their abilities and needs. This powerful critique underscores Marx's insistence on self-emancipation of the working class and his vision of a post-capitalist society where human potential can fully flourish beyond economic and social oppression.
Curious to dive into the mind of Karl Marx? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of the critique of the Gotha Program in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.